My wife smirked. Don't worry about the flights. My ex said he'd cover you if you're broke. I said nothing. After I saw the $20K charge, I made one phone call. She was packing when her ex called her, screaming so loud I could hear him. Your husband just ruined me. She said it with that thin-lipped, upper-toothed smirk, the kind she only pulled out when she was absolutely certain she was the smartest person in the room. I was standing at the kitchen counter on a Tuesday evening with a glass of water in my hand, the kind of unremarkable moment that should have meant nothing, and yet every detail of it is burned into me like a photograph left too long in developer fluid. The overhead light was casting that warm, amber glow she had always loved. A half-empty bottle of Sauvignon Blanc on the island. Her fingers wrapped around the stem of her glass like she was posing for something. She was swirling that wine like a woman who had already written the ending to a story I was not supposed to finish. I nodded slowly, like a man swallowing a pill whole. Like a man who had already decided the most powerful thing he could do was absolutely nothing. She took that as surrender. She always did. I had learned something important about my wife over our 4 years of marriage. She was brilliant at reading aggression and completely blind to stillness. If I raised my voice, she recalibrated. If I went quiet in the wrong way, she sensed it. But if I went quiet in the right way, the way that looked exactly like defeat, she relaxed completely. She exhaled. She stopped watching. That Tuesday evening, I gave her the most convincing performance of defeat I had ever managed, and then I waited for her to fall asleep. She drifted off on the couch around 10:30 with the television still running and the remote resting in her open hand like a scepter. I watched her for a moment. Then I walked to the kitchen table, opened my laptop, and pulled up the joint card account. The one she swore she never touched anymore. The one still linked to my email for transaction alerts. I had stopped checking it months ago because she had asked me to, gently and reasonably, the way she asked for most things that were actually instructions. But the alert still came to my inbox, and 3 weeks earlier, one of them had landed with a subject line I read twice before I understood what I was looking at. $20,470, sitting there on the screen with the same quiet weight as a stone dropped into deep water. Business class round trip, 2 passengers, international. The destination was a city in southern France I had mentioned once, casually, over dinner about a year ago as somewhere I had always wanted to visit. The booking was made through a corporate travel portal I had never seen before, and the departure date was set for the following Thursday, which meant she had been planning this for weeks while asking me if I wanted Thai food or Italian on Friday nights. My name was on the passenger list, so was hers, but the billing profile belonged to neither of us. It belonged to a company. And buried inside the transaction metadata, in a field most people never think to expand, was a small suffix. A neat little corporate tag. 3 letters and a 4-digit department code that identified the fund source as clearly as a signature on a check. Her ex assumed no one would ever check that field. He assumed wrong. I want to be precise about who this man was, because the precision matters. He was not some insignificant figure she had dated briefly before we met. He was the co-founder and public face of a mid-sized technology firm that had raised 2 rounds of institutional funding and was in the process of positioning itself for a significant acquisition. He was polished, he was well-connected, he hosted panels at industry conferences and gave interviews where he talked about integrity and operational discipline with the kind of practiced sincerity that takes years to develop. He was also, as I had discovered 3 weeks earlier when I started building my folder, someone who had been using a discretionary executive development fund as a personal expense account for the better part of 18 months. I did not confront her that night. I closed the laptop and I went to bed. I lay in the dark and I breathed steadily, and I thought about the folder I had been quietly assembling. Scanned receipts forwarded from alerts she did not know I still received. Screenshots of booking confirmations. A corporate card code that had appeared on 3 separate personal charges over 6 months, each one just below the threshold that would have triggered automatic review. The flight was different. The flight was sloppy. The flight was the kind of mistake that happens when someone has gotten away with something for so long that they stop checking the details. Here is what neither of them knew. Years before my wife and I ever met, I spent a brief but genuinely lucrative stretch consulting for his startup during its early finance build-out. I was brought in to design internal audit triggers for their expense management system. I sat in their conference room for 11 weeks with their head of operations, and I built the exact logic that governed what got flagged, what got escalated, and what got quietly buried. I knew the thresholds. I knew the workarounds people tried. I knew that the single most reliable tripwire in the whole system was the $15,000 dual authorization requirement. Any single booking above that number required sign-off from 2 board members, not just a manager, not just a department head. The board. He had tried to bypass it by splitting the charge across 2 separate billing phases processed 48 hours apart. He probably thought that was elegant. The travel portal, however, bundled all legs of an international itinerary into one passenger manifest record, as every major corporate travel system does, and the manifest flagged both passenger names simultaneously. One of those names was mine. I had not given permission for my name to appear on a corporate travel document for a company I had not worked for in years. That detail alone was enough, but I had much more than that detail. I want to be honest about why I did not go to the company's internal compliance team. People think compliance is where wrongdoing gets addressed. What compliance actually is, in most mid-sized firms, is where wrongdoing gets translated into careful language and then weighed against the cost of disruption. I had watched that process from the inside. I knew that if I submitted my documentation through official channels, it would sit in a queue, get reviewed by someone whose job depended on not upsetting leadership, and eventually result in a quiet conversation and a repayment arrangement that nobody outside the building would ever hear about. That was not what I was building toward. Instead, I opened a new email on a Thursday morning while she was at a spin class, and I wrote 5 sentences to the one man her ex had genuinely feared since the day they co-founded the company together. The quiet one. The man who held the larger equity stake and almost never appeared in press coverage because he understood that visibility was a liability. The one who had called me personally when I finished the consulting engagement to say he wished I was staying on full-time. I still had his direct address. I had never used it for anything. I used it that morning. The subject line read, Expenditure Review, Quarter 3 Flag. Clean. Administrative. The kind of subject line that gets opened before coffee goes cold. The body was 5 sentences. I noted a discrepancy in the corporate travel pool tied to what appeared to be personal use. I noted that unapproved international travel had been booked for 2 non-employees through an executive development fund. I noted that one of those non-employees was the co-founder. I attached the passenger manifest, the charge screenshot, the card metadata with the department code visible and expanded, and 2 additional receipts from my folder showing the same card code on earlier personal charges. Then I closed the laptop and I went for a walk. A long one. Down to the park at the end of our street and back 3 times while the birds were loud and the morning was still cool and the world had not yet moved. His assistant replied 47 minutes later. 1 word. Received. In the language of that particular office, I already knew what that word meant. It did not mean acknowledged and filed. It meant the sequence had already started. She had no idea. That evening, she came into the kitchen humming something low and tuneless, a floral scarf wrapped loosely in her hair, her phone tilted at the angle she used when she was reading something that was making her smile. She leaned against the refrigerator and asked me, lightly, breezily, as though it had just occurred to her, whether I was still sore about the flight thing. She said it was just a joke. She said Marcus had a great sense of humor, and I would love him if I gave him a chance. Then she laughed at something on her phone and walked back down the hall. I stood at the stove and I stirred something in a pan, and I did not say a single word. The email I had sent that morning had already triggered 3 internal alerts within his company's finance system. The co-founder's assistant had already forwarded my attachment to 2 board members, and somewhere across the city, in an office building with floor-to-ceiling windows that Marcus had once described in a magazine profile as a symbol of radical transparency, a conversation was happening that he had not been invited to. 3 days passed. I watched her move through those days like someone floating in warm water, completely unaware that the temperature was changing. She reorganized her closet. She had a long phone call that she took outside on the back patio, laughing with her back to the kitchen window. She started pulling items out and laying them on the bed in what I recognized as the early architecture of packing: silk scarves folded in thirds, branded makeup bags arranged by size, 3 pairs of sunglasses for a 5-day trip, a linen blazer in a dry cleaning bag she had clearly picked up without mentioning it. I was down the hall in the study with the door open, sitting at my desk with nothing on the screen, listening to the rhythm of her heels clicking back and forth across the hardwood floor. It sounded exactly like a countdown clock she could not hear. Then her phone rang. I heard her answer it. I heard the brightness in her voice when she said his name. And then I heard everything change. His voice came through her speaker so loud, so cracked and ragged at the edges, that I could hear every single word from across the house as clearly as if he were standing in our hallway. He was not speaking. He was not even shouting in the normal sense of the word. He was unraveling, the kind of sound a person makes when something they built over years comes apart in a single afternoon and they cannot yet process the scale of what they are looking at. She staggered back a step. I heard the edge of the bed frame catch her. I heard her say his name twice in a small voice, a completely different voice than the one she had been using for the past 3 days. What he told her, in that fractured torrent of words I was not supposed to hear, was this. The Quiet co-founder had convened an emergency board session that morning. Every charge Marcus had run through the Executive Development Fund had been pulled and printed, 18 months of documentation laid out across a table. The total was not just the flight. The total, across all flagged charges, was somewhere north of $68,000. The board had voted unanimously to freeze his access to company accounts, pending a full external audit. His equity stake was subject to a clawback provision in the original partnership agreement that had been triggered the moment the board voted. The acquisition talks, which had been months in progress and which would have made him genuinely wealthy, had been suspended by the acquiring firm within hours of being informed, because their own due diligence team had strict protocols around financial misconduct, and they had been watching his company closely enough to move fast. And the co-founder, the quiet one, had already retained outside counsel. Not for the company, personally, because the misuse of investor funds crossed lines that went beyond internal discipline. She was sitting on the edge of the bed when I walked down the hall and stood in the doorway. The phone was in her lap. The screen had gone dark. The 3 pairs of sunglasses were still fanned out on the duvet beside her, but they looked different now. They looked like props from a play that had just been canceled. She looked up at me, and her face was doing something complicated, cycling through versions of itself the way faces do when the story a person has been telling themselves suddenly stops being available. I watched her arrive at the version that was just tired, just stripped down and tired and looking at me across a room that felt very large. She asked me how long I had known. I told her about the email alert from 3 weeks ago. I told her about the folder. I told her about the consulting work I had done years before she and I ever met, the audit triggers I had built, the $15,000 threshold, and the reason the travel portal had bundled the manifest the way it did. I told her all of it in the same steady voice I had been using all week, the quiet voice that she had mistaken for defeat. She did not speak for a long time. When she did, she asked me why I had not said anything directly to her. I thought about that question carefully before I answered it, because it deserved a careful answer. I told her that there was a version of this where I came to her directly, and she made different choices, and we had a difficult but honest conversation, and something different happened. I told her I had genuinely considered that version, but I also told her that the smirk at the kitchen counter, the casual joke about whether I could afford my own flight, the 3 days of watching her pack sunglasses for a trip booked on someone else's stolen fund, the way she had been humming, had settled something in me that I could not unsettle. It was not just that she had been planning to go, it was the ease of it, the comfort, the complete absence of any visible weight. She had not been carrying this like someone doing something wrong. She had been carrying it like someone doing something simple. She left 2 weeks later. Not on a flight to southern France. In a car to her sister's apartment across town with the things she had been packing already in bags that now served a different purpose. We did not fight. There was nothing left to fight about. The fighting requires a certain shared investment in the outcome, and by the time she drove away, I think we both understood that the investment had already been spent somewhere else. Quietly, in increments neither of us had been watching closely enough. What happened to Marcus is a matter of some public record now, the kind of corporate story that lands in a trade publication as 3 short paragraphs about a leadership transition and an audit and a deal that did not close. The quiet co-founder took the company forward. The acquisition eventually reopened under new terms and new leadership. Marcus's name is not in the current byline. His equity clawback left him with considerably less than he had been expecting, and the outside counsel situation resolved in a way that involved a repayment agreement and a non-disclosure and a period of professional visibility that looked very much like none at all. I know some of this from mutual contacts and some of it from the brief and formal email the quiet co-founder sent me several months later, thanking me for the flag and noting that the internal systems had been significantly strengthened. He did not ask how I had come to have access to the metadata. He already knew. He was the quiet one. He had always watched everything from a distance. I sit with that Tuesday evening sometimes, the amber kitchen light, the wine glass, the smirk. I sit with the particular silence of knowing something and choosing not to show it. I think about the moment the email landed in my inbox with its $20,470 line item and how still everything went inside me. Not cold, not angry, just still, like water finding its level. There is a version of me who would have thrown the glass, who would have put the laptop on the counter and pointed at the screen and demanded an explanation in a voice loud enough to wake the neighbors. That version of me would have gotten a practiced response, a calibrated performance, and a story massaged into something just plausible enough to make me doubt my own eyes. He assumed wrong. She assumed wrong. They both assumed the same thing about the same man, which was that the silence was emptiness. It was not emptiness. It was everything I needed, held perfectly still, waiting for the right moment to move.